Really, the two big takeaways are obviously Sweden joining, a huge moment for NATO. And between Sweden and Finland, Russia now has twice the border with NATO that it had before the war last year. But I think the really most momentous event is this G7 security pledge and guarantee to Ukraine. And I think it's incredibly important, not just military security, but also providing technical and financial assistance so that Ukraine can really start to build its economy in a way that attracts foreign investment as it's trying to rebuild after this war.
The Ukrainian team seemed quite frustrated by the lack of clarity around the timeline for joining the NATO alliance. Was there any other way? Was it possible for NATO to be any clearer with its timeline given the conflict?
No, I mean, I think Zelensky obviously was frustrated, and his tweet in the middle of the day 2 days ago reflected that. But I think NATO was clear all along. Ukraine could not join while they're in the middle of a war. I think they've laid all the signposts out for Ukraine to join when the time is right, and they're clearly on the path to joining. And I think at the end of the day, Zelensky got pretty much everything he could have gotten out of the summit, including a lot more weaponry.
I want to come back to your point about the G7 pledge and financial support, because what happens beyond this war is also in consideration here. So far, what the World Bank was estimating about $411 billion to reconstruct Ukraine, and already there's a debate playing out. Who pays for it? Is it the frozen Russian money that is redeployed? But of course, that raises questions around international law. The other point is whether there should be some other way of paying for this, a one-off levy on Russia as well. So how do we think about this in the context of the G7 saying we will provide support, but of course we know there's another leg to this down the track?
Well, there are a lot of ideas about how to pay for this, as you just mentioned, and I think, first of all, having the G7 nations all on the same page regarding that will be critically important, so hopefully this will be a step in that direction. And I think, but part of what the G7 is doing is helping Ukraine to build, institutions to have rule of law, to work on anti-corruption efforts, which will be clearly very important. Many of our clients are very interested in getting into Ukraine after this war is over to help them to rebuild, but there are concerns about rule of law and corruption. I think having the G7 setting up a framework to help Ukraine build its civil society and its institutions will be very, very important in that effort.
Lew, I think what is really interesting is there's going to be a push in the G7 statement, or at least we think there is, to actually make the framework outlast election cycles. And that is absolutely fascinating for you and I and for everyone else, because, of course, we know how Donald Trump tried to, let's be honest about it, strong-arm Mr. Zelensky. And that was a whole controversial scandal in itself while he was president as well. So outlasting election cycles, that's a really interesting caveat, isn't it?
I mean, not just election cycles in the U.S., but also election cycles in Ukraine, too, right? It's important to have the leaders of all the G7 nations and Ukraine on the same page and to have consistency over time. But you're right. I think there's a lot of worry that I hear in Europe from allies about what happens if Donald Trump gets reelected to office, what happens to all these agreements and these alliances. So I think as much as people can election-proof these agreements, it's very important.
Hi, I'm Joanna Bersecci, and thank you for watching. You can check out more of our videos by clicking on the boxes on the screen. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more from CNBC International. Thank you for watching.